It's Dr. Sabrina Siegel here with a special series brought to you by the NEI Podcast. Welcome to the PsychopharmaStahlogy Show. In this special series, Dr. Andrew Cutler interviews Dr. Stephen Stahl on the most controversial, novel, and exciting topics in psychopharmacology today. Every 3 months, we will address a different theme in psychopharmacology. Each theme is split into 3 parts with 1 part released each month. This theme is on dark psychiatry and coercive persuasion. This theme focuses on Dr. Joel Dimsdale's new book, Dark Persuasion, on brainwashing and social media, and on the dark side of neuroplasticity. Let's listen in to part 3, Dark Neuroplasticity.
Hello and welcome to another NEI Podcast. Today is another episode of the PsychopharmaStahlogy Show, and I'm Dr. Andy Cutler. Our show is titled today, Dark Neuroplasticity, and this is the third part really of a trilogy. We started out talking about brainwashing, then we got into dark persuasion, and now we're going to talk about neuroplasticity. And with me, as always, of course, is Dr. Stephen Stahl. How are you doing, Steve?
Great, Andy. Great to be here.
All right. Well, we have been sort of talking around this one for a while, and really the idea of neuroplasticity is gaining prominence in our field. How should we think about normal versus pathologic neuroplasticity?
Well, Andy, even though you and I are old guys, our brains aren't completely dead.
Oh, that's good to hear.
That's good to hear. We can't make many new neurons, but we sure can make new connections. And so neuroplasticity lasts a lifetime. Of course, you're making new connections furiously earlier in life, which, by the way, is the time of life when most psychiatric disorders occur. But then more slowly through the rest of life, there is continuing neuroplasticity. And I must say, we don't understand it very well. Mm-hmm. We are normally making and removing connections all the time. And that is probably the way the brain functions. It certainly is a good candidate for learning. But one of the things that's interesting is neuroplasticity, which is basically happening. We don't understand. One of the best examples of that is, do you know that at least in rodents has been studied where you can actually look at a female brain in the hypothalamus, and during the single menstrual cycle, there are a huge number of synapses made and then removed at the end. Made and removed. What's that about? And so that certainly is normal. And so you could call that normal neuroplasticity. Maybe somebody listening in today is having a neuroplastic moment, in case we're teaching them something. And that
certainly
would be normal neuroplasticity too.
Yes. Well, let's back up even further. When we talk about neuroplasticity, we're not talking about creating new neurons. What exactly are we talking about?
It's really connections. So that would be that, the old dendrites, and it's got a tree. And so those dendritic trees can actually proliferate, not unlike a bush in your yard or a tree in your yard. And so it branches and grows. And every place on that dendrite where you see a branch, there's actually an incoming axon to innervate that branch. And so that's occurring all the time. So it's only the making and losing of synapses that is considered neuroplasticity. As you mentioned, there are only very few places in the brain of an adult where any new neurons are made. So we're really talking about connections.
So we're talking about arborization. And is this what we mean also when we talk about dendritic sprouting and dendritic spines?
Right. Spine is, of course, a bump, if you will,
right,
on a neuron, and it's really the place where many synapses occur. Some synapses occur right on the base of the dendrite, and others, of course, on the cell body, and some even on the presynaptic neuron. But a lot of them are on these spines, and the spines actually have a head. And every place there's a head of the spine, there's pretty much always a glutamate neuron coming in. Mm-hmm. And on the neck of the spines are the other things like serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, particularly. So they're there to actually shape the incoming excitatory input. And of course, if you had a neuron that's not receiving that information, somehow mysteriously, I guess so far, the bump appears and an incoming axon appears. Now, is that axon, where's it coming from? And is it the one that's making the bump be manufactured? Because as you know, in order for that spine to be made, information has to be received from the cell nucleus to pack up some proteins and ship them down there and maybe a few mitochondria for some energy. And while you're at it, dendrites are postsynaptic. So throw me in a couple of postsynaptic receptors. How does that happen? How does the neuron know which receptors to package in there? Is it a serotonin? Is it a 1A or a 2C? Wow, it's amazing.
It is amazing. And how fast does this happen?
It can happen in 20 minutes.
Wow. That's remarkable.
Now, there's if us old guys are trying to learn a new language, it may never happen over months, or something like that. But it turns out that we have found that certain drugs can make this happen as well, virtually before the end of a 1-hour infusion. And so we didn't know that you had that kind of capacity in your brain. Now, when you're just doing it that way, what are the connections that are being made? What is the function of those? Still a wild card.
So it sounds like we actually, first of all, every experience we have, it sounds like, is influencing this process, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's probably true. And it could very well be that some experiences just ride on a current circuit. In other words, you got a circuit for that experience and you don't need a synapse. Maybe you don't do it. Maybe make it stronger. One of the principles with us neuroplasticity are the old sayings that use it or lose it. So that, if you don't keep using that circuit, it goes away. Or you could say the nerves that fire together, wire together. And so you could say every experience either probably strengthens a synapse. It may not form one, but new experiences probably do.
Yeah. Yeah. So how else can we influence neuroplasticity?
I think it's a matter of both environment and neurobiology. So learning probably has fairly profound changes. Experiences do, but so do drugs. And that's part of the issue of this podcast is the neuroplasticity that we would like to use therapeutically, but being very respectful of both of the process and of our ignorance of the process. It very well may be that, say, for example, most known antidepressants may actually also work as a final common pathway of neuroplasticity. That's one of the hot hypotheses out there. And that maybe the latter means, which are most of the current antidepressants, do that more slowly. It takes a couple of weeks at least, if not a couple of months. And that if you fail to do that, maybe your depression doesn't get better. But how's that happening? Where is it happening? Is it always good?
I see. So neuroplasticity could be the final common pathway of how many of our medications work.
Yes, it's certainly in the area of mood. That's the hottest hypothesis because now we have drugs that do it suddenly and they have sudden therapeutic actions, making us think that's why. Sudden neuroplasticity might equal sudden efficacy.
Fascinating. So you're talking about drugs like ketamine, obviously.
Right. That was the first one that really came on the scene. And it is true that you can do those same experiments in rodents and show that in 20 minutes, you have basically a whole bunch of new bumps that are made. Now, what are those neurons saying to each other? It's associated with two things. First of all, a dissociative experience, and secondly, with improvement from depression in many cases. So we've thought that's part of improving from depression. But the reality is you're dunking the brain into a bucket of ketamine when you give a ketamine infusion, and it's probably causing synapses all over the place. Are they all needed? Are they all good? Which ones do we want? Which ones do we want to preserve? As you know, ketamine doesn't last in a lot of people. And so does that mean those synapses come and go?
Yeah, that's really remarkable. I hadn't thought about it like that. You're creating all of these synapses. In a way, that reminds me of ECT, Steve. I mean, you're shocking the whole brain, and you get this kind of specific antidepressant result.
Right. Now, I'm not aware of exactly the neuroplasticity studies after ECT, but I think you do change it and do it so suddenly. And so I think the reason we're talking about this caught being dark neuroplasticity is just to be thoughtful.
Yes.
Can you really think that every time you cause a neuroplastic event, it's going to be good? In fact, dark neuroplasticity is probably what causes psychiatric symptoms. So if you end up having pain that persists, it changes the pain circuit in a way in which you can get neuropathic pain, of course, and chronic pain.
Mm-hmm.
If you have, look, just listen, everybody listening here. Have you noticed that the more psychiatric symptoms you have, the more you get, the harder they are to treat, the worse they are to treat, the longer they last. So panic begets panic, pain begets pain. Maybe substance abuse is a form of dark neuroplasticity in which somehow the circuits learn to want and crave for drugs. And that one dose doesn't do it, but several doses do. So there's all sorts of worries that the brain full of bad neuroplasticity has symptoms, but that if we could redirect that to good neuroplasticity, then we would be therapeutic.
Right. So some of these things can get hardwired. You talked about the concept of wiring together, and hopefully there are ways that we can rewire, unwire, disconnect the bad circuits, And I'm wondering, psychotherapy, it may be a form of altering neuroplasticity.
It certainly is. Yeah, it's a form of learning, if you will. And there's no doubt about that. And so that could be good and bad. And one of the concerns I have about all this hoo-ha with, psychedelics and MDMA, and doing it maybe in a setting of a psychotherapeutic experience, is, do we really know what we're doing? It can be well-intentioned that you're trying to remove things when you are having neuroplasticity, that you're trying to, for example, often the brain doesn't ever get rid of its memory, but you can create a new synapse that blocks it. So that's kind of the idea of addictions and of trauma. It may never be that once you're addicted, your brain may never be the same. But is it possible? I mean, certainly some people stop at being addicted. It's not as common as we'd like. But the idea is maybe they're forming a new circuit that blocks the old one. Same thing with post-traumatic stress disorder. Can we really remove the original memory? Or can we make, new neuroplasticity that blocks the memory or that blocks the associated affective experiences associated with the triggering of the memory? So those are the ideas out there right now. But we don't know how to control that. And so I think that one of the worries that I just have is that we're out there with an uncontrolled environment given psilocybin, and every Tom, Dick, and Harry who thinks he can do psychotherapy is going to do that. I'm saying we should be a little humble here. Remember the book that is the basis of this whole neuroplasticity and dark persuasion, 3 triple pods that we're doing. Remembered that the first people who used dark neuroplasticity were the CIA to try to brainwash people. And are we doing anything other than sort of therapeutic brainwashing?
Yeah, that's really fascinating. But you got me thinking about a concept here, Steve, when you talk about almost a scar forming in the brain with these negative circuits. And so it's there, and we're just trying to manage it and work around it, I guess, or cover it up.
Right. So, to what extent is that scar reversible, or can it be compensated? We don't know, but we do know symptoms go away. And so wouldn't it be nice to do that on purpose and to actually control it? And so, all these new drugs that are out there, whether it's the hallucinogens or it's ketamine, or it's even rapid onset with some of the GABA drugs, how do they do that? And is it all good? And is there any way we could screw it up? I mean, one of the things I want to make sure is that we don't, in the service of trying to be therapeutic, do something inadvertent that is actually bad neuroplasticity. Because as we just talked about in this podcast so far, there's a such thing as good neuroplasticity and there's a such thing as bad.
That's so true. And you got me thinking also developmentally, that period early in life when you have so many synapses form and then they get pruned down. And it got me thinking, you're right, that a lot of these things we're talking about are just forming almost indiscriminate synapses. And how do we prune them? How do we direct them? And how do we get the healthy ones to form?
Right. And that's a really good point. Is it possible that you want reverse neuroplasticity. The memory of that bomb that went off that made me upset in Vietnam, I'd like to have that one pruned, please, sir. And I don't know how you do that. But you're right. Sometimes the synapse is actually inhibited and sometimes it's pruned. As you and the audience probably remember, is that your brain furiously wires during birth and the first 6 years of your life. And then somewhere in the adolescent period, your brain assassinates 50% of its synapses. What? That's a crazy way to manufacture a brain, but that's what we do. And so it's thought that in the wrong selection of synapses to be removed, that therefore symptoms of psychiatric disorders emerge. And so neurodevelopmental stuff of maybe a more mild to moderate amount give you ADHD, and developmental problems of a greater degree could give you autism or schizophrenia. Now, if the brain unwired that way, could we rewire it by both getting rid of bad synapses and making new ones? We already know that, if you use it, you make it. So that's why, practice of things and doing things that repeat will tend to make a new synapse. And that's why it's possible to do that. But when you take a dose of psilocybin, you make a whole bunch of synapses without doing anything.
That is scary. You got me thinking here. My wife and I are taking dancing lessons, and we have a lesson tonight. So I've been thinking about this, about how am I forming these circuits and getting this to be more second nature, because right now it's really awkward.
Well, you're right. It's a motor memory. There's no question that you make motor programs, and the brain is actually a bunch of little programs. And so whether it's a motor program or a mental program, and so what we want to do is understand it, shape it, and make sure that we don't do bad neuroplasticity and that we enhance the durability. Because one of the funny things, not really funny, but interesting funny about this neuroplasticity is that in some cases it seems to endure. Have you ever heard of a drug that you could give for 2 weeks and then you don't need to take it anymore and it still works?
That would be great. I have not.
And it looks like there are candidates for that. The various NMDA antagonists, some have been studied, like S-methadone, for a week or two, and then it has enduring effects. Certainly the zuranolone, it works for 2 weeks, then you stop it. So, there have been questions of who responds and who doesn't. Who needs to be rechallenged? Lots of new questions. But, look at the potential here. A lot of people are looking at some of the zuranolone data and saying, well, it's not that big an effect. And by the way, if you're testing it against an SSRI, the SSRI catches up with it. But what I say is, anybody on this podcast ever treat adolescents, particularly? Tell me which adolescent likes to take antidepressants, And so what if you had an antidepressant, had very few side effects, you only took it for 2 weeks and it kept working? Wow!
That'd be great.
So, the reality is there's new ways to begin to think about things. And so understanding neuroplasticity is the neuroscientific basis of what I just talked about. What drug do you give? When do you give it? Do you give it in a setting where you have to do psychotherapy? Who can get the best benefit out of it for fast onset and durability after the drug stops? That is now all possible through neuroplasticity. We don't understand it completely, but that's possible.
Yeah, that really is the question, isn't it? How durable is neuroplasticity? And how can we impact this? Especially in what happens during the aging process? Are we losing things? Are we still able to form new circuits and new connections?
Well, I don't know. We'll find out if you actually can learn how to dance in the long run, but it's possible that you can do that. Yeah. And hopefully people on this podcast are learning too, and they haven't given up on their neuroplasticity.
No, my wife during COVID started taking Spanish lessons online too. She's learning Spanish. So, this sounds like a healthy way to adapt and cope here. There must be other ways to enhance and preserve our circuits. And I'm thinking, for instance, exercise and antioxidants and diet and having positive experiences with friends or meditation or yoga. What do you think about all these ways to maybe positively influence?
Well, I think it's empirically been shown to be the case. But again, we don't know how to control it very much. But there's no question that if you have immune inflammation in your brain, a lot of this stuff is not going to happen. So if you exercise, it's interesting you brought that up because people say, well, what kind of exercise? You mean like learning Spanish, or doing a kind of a puzzle over and over again? Some of these cognitive gains, is that cognitive exercising and to be able to keep my circuits? And the funny thing is, not really. Those things that are cognitive exercises, if you want to call them that, tend to make the task that you're doing get better, but it doesn't generalize outside that task. So you can get really good at your dumb game, but it's not going to help you remember license plate numbers or whatever. On the other hand, exercise is ubiquitous. And there's something about exercise that causes neuroplasticity. Go figure. Physical exercise.
Physical exercise, yeah. Yeah, well, we know there's many benefits to physical exercise. Obviously, you're releasing endorphins and cannabinoids and improving, just like any muscle, you exercise, you get better blood flow.
Right.
So there's got it. And there's antioxidant properties and anti-inflammatory properties.
So setting the stage with good health is an exercise and diet and not having the metabolic syndrome where you have a lot of inflammatory stuff going on. That all kind of sets the stage. And then there may be things that you can do without drugs that are just more psychotherapy. When it works, it probably does cause neuroplasticity.
It's got me thinking, though. I mean, as you said, there's many well-meaning therapists out there, but I wonder if there are certain forms of therapy that are not good or maybe not good for a certain kind of patient. There is a lot of this matching thing that we just don't know.
Yeah, I think we have to just be careful. I mean, remember that get back to the CIA tried to use this both for brainwashing, which means changing a communist to, somebody that's a capitalist or whatever. But, maybe, the Republicans and Democrats get a hold of this. They'll try to change our, thinking to the other party. So it's possible that that's kind of ridiculous, but it's possible more likely that, just some journeyman psychotherapist inadvertently, is introducing something that's either not helpful or possibly damaging. And we want to avoid that. And so there's a lot of questions about how to use these drugs. And because of that, I'm actually more in favor of the approach where you try to take these dissociative experiences out of the neuroplasticity.
Yes.
So what's happening now is that you have different types of experiences, like ketamine is more of a dissociative experience, if you will, whereas psilocybin is more of a hallucination, but maybe more visual and very sensory. Whereas finally you've got things like MDMA, which is maybe a warm, fuzzy feeling type of thing.
Right. And pathogens.
And so those are different experiences. And so is it possible, but they're all associated with neuroplasticity. So is it possible that, the different biochemical mechanisms, but they do all cause branching within 20 minutes type of thing in a rodent model? Is it possible to have the branching without the experience? And there are some companies that are going that way, but many of the ones that we're hearing about are trying to do, if you will, sort of a high-end, probably cash practice, very expensive thing where you bring a patient in for an hour or a day and you give them one dose and then you do, I don't know, God only knows what they're doing for a psychotherapy for a day. And then it's that experience. I don't know, Andy, I'll ask you this. How many patients have you seen come back to you in your practice that have had a psilocybin, mushroom, ayahuasca, or MDMA experience? And I would say I can think of at least 20 patients that have all come back to me and said, oh my God, that was the most amazing experience I ever had. It was life-altering and it's going on around. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, I'm still treating them for their treatment-resistant depression.
Right.
And so I don't see any connection of the dots. But you talk to those people, they actually think they got better or that they wouldn't have substituted it. So there's something profound about the experience but I'm not sure it has anything to do with neuroplasticity that cures them.
Well, of course, we don't know that the experience is essential to this process. There are companies now developing what's called second-generation psychedelics that don't have the experience. And certainly you mentioned S-methadone, and there's also others in development that work through an MDA but don't cause the dissociative experience.
Well, I'm voting for those so far.
Yeah. So it may not be necessary. It may not be a necessary part of this neuroplasticity process.
It could be that the brain is a homeostatic organ, and that means it wants to maintain calmness, general normality. And if given a chance to go back to normal, maybe it would tend to do that anyway. So if you just kickstart neuroplasticity, my blind, maybe naive hope is that the brain would know what to do in order to try to help cure itself. And there's also this thing called allostasis, which is when the brain usually gets into trouble, okay, in which case one circuit goes out, then another one, and then another one, and another one. And that creates the syndromes of DSM. So first you have guilt, then you have insomnia, and then you have, sadness, etc. And then you have major depressive disorder. So that's a bad, vicious cycle. It seems that maybe neuroplasticity begins to trigger a virtuous cycle, so that one thing gets better, then another, and then another. And I don't know that's the case, but if there were a way to try to do that on purpose and to figure out how to help that process along, and then to do it. So some people think you have to dose these neuroplastic agents weekly or something like that. Some think you give it a week or two and then stop. And then if the patient doesn't remit, or they poop out, then you hit them again with another dose. All of this is still in process, but whether, we know how to do it, and I don't think we do, what the audience listening here should know is that your brain can actually change all the time with experiences and medications. And if we could harness that, we'd be better psychiatrists.
No question about it. No doubt. I'm thinking too about this, you're talking about this model of intermittent treatment that certainly we know zuranolone, they're using that model. It occurs to me a lot of treatment in psychiatry probably is intermittent anyway. If you look at prescription refill data, people are stopping their medicines all the time.
Only your patients, my patients take their medicines.
100%.
Actually, we all think that, don't we? Is it my patient?
Do.
And the patients are all fooling us.
Well, I've actually changed my practice. I've actually now started going with that wave. And I tell people, look, the odds are you're going to stop the medicine at some point. That's fine. Just get back in touch with me. Let's get started again as soon as we can and prevent the crisis from happening. I mean, that's just human nature.
Well, there is an issue of a movement in our field called deprescribing. And actually, funny enough, I'm supposed to be a psychopharmacologist to see complex patients. And many times my consult is to stop some of the meds.
Yes. I've said that many times. I feel like I've done more good in my career stopping medicine than starting medicine sometimes.
So there's a lot of, basically superfluous medication, gratuitous prescribing that should be stopped. And yes, people start and stop, but there's also a question whether, long-term antidepressants actually either get tachyphylaxis or that there's a poop out or recurrence despite the continuation of the drug.
Right.
So I think we have to be minded about, how long we should give medicines. And I'm very excited about the possibility that you could pulse people. And then, if you're highly motivated and you're suffering, you're probably going to take all 2 weeks of your medicine, even a teenager. And so, so the issue is that's going to give you a lot of compliance, and we could work with that.
Yeah, I think so. But you can also have me thinking, Steve, what are these combinations of medicines doing in people's brains? You've talked a lot about the concept of rational versus irrational polypharmacy. What is happening in the brain of people who are taking all these different medicines?
Well, I think sometimes bad things in the sense that you have gratuitous, talking to receptors you don't need. But on the other hand, the brain works in circuits. Circuits are connected at synapses. And if you've got a circuit with, say 12 synapses in it, you might have 12 chemicals. So on the one hand, you don't want to be irrational, just throw stuff at people, clearly. But on the other hand, if God commits polypharmacy, why can't we? And so the natural thing is, and believe me, there was a paper that came out recently that suggested that combination antidepressants work better than single antidepressants. So there may be some wisdom to doing this somewhat rationally, in which case you're trying to get what I call bad math, synergy, where you have a circuit that you're trying to get to perform in a better way. And if you hit one node at that circuit, it helps a bit. But if you could hit another node downstream with a different neurotransmitter, you'll get synergy where the total output's greater than the sum of the parts, and the patient gets much better. So I'm a great believer in synergy and in co-therapy and trying to do this rationally. But the usual way that this happens is that somebody starts a drug, gets a partial response, and they're afraid to stop the drug, so they add another one. They get a little more response. They don't want to stop either one of them. Pretty soon you're on 6.
Yeah. Well, it does make me think, though, what's the most effective antipsychotic we have? Clozapine is very multimodal, and we don't even understand how it works anyway. So I had a professor, you love this, who used to say I was training at the dawn of the SSRIs, and they were talking about how great these, selective and clean and all of this. And he scoffed. He said, dirty drugs are better.
Well, I think they are. And there's Brian Roth is somebody in our field, and he wrote a paper I like very much. It's called Magic Shotguns versus Magic Bullets. And I think that, there's a bad shotgun, but there's a magic shotgun. And so the idea is that we have learned certain, say, for example, antidepressant combinations that work better. And then this one story suggested in this paper I just was quoting that an alpha-2 antagonist put together with a reuptake blocker was the very best among all the combinations that they had.
Right. You're talking about the mirtazapine, yeah.
Yes. So, and then in the area of antipsychotics, the idea would be certainly you need D2 antagonism, but some serotonin antagonism helps. But on the horizon, there's the possibility of adding, trace amine agonists or acetylcholine muscarinic agonists to D2 antagonists to make more synergy in this circuit. And the question is, as the symptom abates, do we get adaptation of neuroplasticity? And I also think that, although it's not as well documented, I think the opposite is, which is that the longer you're out of control, duration of untreated illness, the worse your symptoms get and the harder they are to treat. So when people start and stop medication, there was an article that came out recently that suggested that atypical antipsychotics don't work as well for the 3rd and 4th episode.
Yeah, I saw that, yeah.
And so maybe that's because, we don't know because there's no way to really do ethically this experiment, but what if you had a group of people who had early onset illness and they took the drug for 5 years and another group that stopped it 3 times in 5 years? We do know that the group that starts and stops it over 5 years is going to be worse than they were at the beginning. But had they taken their drug all 5 years, would they be better off? We don't know that yet.
Well, certainly we've all had that experience of patients, for instance, who took an antidepressant, responded, and they come back and we try it again years later and it doesn't work as well. And, you talk about duration of untreated illness. There's certainly a very strong literature in the psychosis literature. They call it DUP, duration of untreated psychosis, very clearly correlates with worse outcomes, particularly early in the illness, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I think that anybody listening to this is going to be, interested in trying to remove symptoms and make sure that I always tell my patients, you get more credit in heaven for the number of symptoms you didn't have rather than the number of pills you didn't take. So some people want to count the number of pills they take, think it's virtue if they take fewer of them. I say, no, don't pay any attention to the number of pills you take. Count your symptoms. And when the symptoms are getting better, you won.
Yeah. I think this also brings up the idea of why it's so important to treat aggressively early on. The earlier maybe we can treat, maybe the more we can influence this process in a positive way or prevent the negative part of it.
I think there's no question about that. And sometimes that puts mental health providers in a bad position because often we don't see the patients early. We see the patients after failures.
That's right.
And so, the cat's out of the bag by then, and it's too many cases.
But it is an argument also in favor of, for instance, long-acting injectables and other ways of enhancing adherence.
Look, until proven otherwise, I'm going to think that a long-acting injectable to keep somebody from having more recurrent psychosis is going to be better than allowing that person to, recur and recur. And so we actually have programs in the California Department of State Hospitals where we're trying to decriminalize mental illness and to take people and provide them housing and medications. And of course, you can't do that involuntarily unless they've committed a crime. But if they have committed a crime, you could make them essentially take medicines and stay in housing instead of be unmedicated and homeless. And, we're trying to see if that facilitates outcome. But, I think a lot of cases, particularly in the area of psychosis, we're treating stage 4 cancer. If you allow people to go chaotically up and down and live on the streets and take all sorts of drugs of abuse, in the case of psychosis, marijuana is a very bad one. And then you have them. I just saw an article this morning that said people, clearly are dying of cardiovascular disease with serious mental illness. And I thought, no, duh, who didn't know that? So, so all these things are happening to these folks. And maybe that has something to do with medications, of course. But we do have options that have a lot less of that. And of course, if you have a lifestyle that's off the street and in housing, it's possible that you can mitigate that. So I think that we need to treat the hell out of people early.
I totally agree. It is hard, though. It's early on, especially in these illnesses, people are in denial and the illness affects their insight and judgment. And nobody wants to take our medicines.
No.
So it is a big challenge. But certainly from the neuroplasticity point of view and the things we're talking about, we need to be more aggressive. We just need to not give up and not be nihilistic about this and just try as hard as we can.
Because it gets back to our theme that if you don't, bad neuroplasticity is working against you.
Keeping up with the latest in psychiatry shouldn't be a struggle. SynovianFieldMedical.com is a new website for clinicians where you can find a library of free, hand-selected resources, such as videos and infographics on important psychiatry topics. You can request an educational program for your practice or connect with Synovian medical professionals in your area. Synovian wants to help you get all of your psychiatry questions answered. Go to SynovianFieldMedical.com and explore what Synovian has to offer.
Okay, let's talk more about that. The title of this is Dark Neuroplasticity. So what do you think is going on there with the
I think the brain learns how to have mental illness, and I think our treatments help you forget it. And so I'm in the treatment business, so I want to learn how to forget. What did I just say? I want to learn how to forget? Yeah, that's what I want to do. And if I can figure out a way to reverse dark neuroplasticity, then that's good. Because it's possible that, we're just symptom suppressing, but it's actually more than that. Because if symptom continuation creates more efficient processing of information, and it gets it worse, and symptom suppression is actually potentially curative. And so people will say, well, if you have a tuberculosis or E. coli in your body and you just give aspirin for fever, that's symptomatic treatment. That's not going to help anything. Right. And there's many areas of medicine where that, of course, is extremely true. But I'm not sure it's true in psychiatry. Psychiatry is almost like the symptom is the illness.
Oh, I see.
And each symptom is its own illness. And each symptom has its own circuit and its own, if you will, set of neurotransmitters. And that's why polypharmacy is fine, because guess what? My patients don't have one symptom. They have many symptoms and many abnormal circuits, and they don't all use the same neurotransmitter. Each circuit has several, but the several of symptom A are not complete match of the several of symptom B. So it does make sense to try to modify those symptoms as needed to suppress them and to help the circuit essentially stop learning to be abnormal. It's as though it gets used to that and say, oh, this is great. I'm having pain all the time. I like pain. I'm having pain when there's nothing, input stimulus. It's just pain and, that's generated from inside the circuit. I'm having anxiety. Nothing's provoking it. I'm just anxious. Well, that's not good. And so to teach that circuit to stop that, stop activating that, anxiety is a good thing. Everybody has to have it once in a while. You have to basically, keep that saber-toothed tiger from getting you. And so it's been in our DNA for a long time, but to have it, firing, false alarms all the time, it's not good.
Clearly. That's an excellent point you're making, Steve, that psychiatric illness very often is an exaggeration of normal moods or normal emotions or normal symptoms to some degree. Depression is important. Grief is important, obviously, to reconsolidate and get on with it. And even to some degree, fantasy and dreams in our unconscious, if that's exaggerated, that becomes psychosis.
Well, I'm having fantasies and dreams just talking to you here. This is my fantasy world. I love doing that. Being creative is a form of being nearly, if you will, pre-psychotic. It's exaggeration, but, I think it's all good for us. And you're right that the same circuits that serve us so functionally can actually be a disservice to us if they're out of control. And that's why we want to try to modulate information processing so that we don't suffer.
Well, that's an interesting question. So how much of this is creating new circuits and how much of it is modulating circuits that are already there?
Well, I think that symptoms play upon circuits that are already there, and treatments play upon abnormal circuits that are already abnormal.
Okay.
That's the way I put it together so far.
So let's talk then about treatment resistance and kind of the ingraining of symptoms. Is this result of new pathological circuits being enhanced, or is it burnout of healthy connections? You see what I'm saying?
Well, it could be all those, but what I have in mind more is really strong synapses where they shouldn't be.
Okay.
Again, the nerves that fire together wire together. And one of the ways to do that, you can measure NMDA receptor density or an AMPA receptor density at glutamate circuits. And the more that you use it, the more dense, particularly AMPA, is. And so that's a bad thing because, the brain is always remodeling as well. We said it's neuroplastic, but it goes in both directions. You're destroying synapses and destroying connections all the time. You may not want to remember what your third grade teacher's dress looked like, on Christmas Day. One of those useless things or memories you want to get rid of that are just junk in your brain.
Yeah, you want to clean out your hard drive.
Clean out the hard drive and the junk. What they call your junk box.
Defragging it. Yeah.
So that's happening. So you want to do it in a way that's helpful. So if you use a circuit too much, it's not going to get emptied. That circuit is immune to being eliminated from neuroplastic, loss mechanisms. And so you have to stop the circuit from operating and firing so much. And that's maybe where the symptom removal. So it's possible that you're not really directly affecting neuroplasticity. What you're doing is you're suppressing the symptom and allowing the circuit to react. I'm not using it as much, so I'm going to lose it a bit. So the idea is don't use it, therefore lose it. That's one of the ways. That's why it takes time.
That makes sense. Addiction is similar to this, as we talked about, and we're thinking addiction may be bad neuroplasticity. Is this a form of diabolical learning?
That's what I call it, isn't it?
It's
evil learning. The circuits have the ability to learn evil things.
Yes.
And I think that we all have that potential. What's interesting, psychosis, ADHD, maybe neurodevelopmental, some of the highest genetic loads of anything we do in psychiatry. But anybody can get addicted to alcohol. Now, there certainly are probably going to be factors about risks for exposure to alcohol causing more addiction in some than others. Yeah. But you take a normal person and feed them enough of a drug, they're going to change. And so I think that bad neuroplasticity, evil neuroplasticity is interesting because it sort of morphs. It starts out with things like, boy, this is fun, to a Pavlovian dog. So you want to have this a Friday night, you want to have a party, you want to get high, and that's fun. It goes away, and maybe you live happily ever after. But after a while, if you do it too much, every time you pass a bar, you crave, and you walk into the bar, you drink. And it's like a Pavlovian dog. You ring the bell, the mouth waters. And what's the bell? In our case, the bell would be, if you're not careful, parties, or if it's going to be the place where you bought the drug, or it's going to be the people, they will signal to your brain, hey, you need this. And it starts a craving, which is relieved, interestingly enough, once you're addicted, not when you take the drug. You know what's relieved? When you see and seek the drug. So you reduce your terrible craving as you seek it. And there are even PET scans showing that when you first take cocaine, for example, your dopamine lights up as soon as cocaine hits your dopamine neurons in the brain, right?
Right.
After you're addicted, it lights up when you fondle the pipe,
Mhm.
when you crush the crystals, a cigarette smoker, when they smell the pack of cigarettes, when they feel it, when they're ready to light it. Sometimes when they feel a coffee cup, because they always have a cigarette in between two
Right.
fingers when they're drinking coffee. So those things are hardwired at that point. They're very neuroplastic that's caused that. And so we don't know how to change that other than forced abstinence, which we hope that, again, you use it and lose it. Well, then you stop using it and then you lose it. But who can do that for 6 months? And people can't do it.
Yeah, and what's also fascinating along these lines is that, almost everybody, Steve, not you, I know, but almost everybody has experimented with drugs or tried drugs. And some people can take it or leave it, and some people go, whoa, I really like this. My brain needs this. So there probably are some genetics involved to some degree or predispositions.
Yeah, and it also depends on whether you're in a bad place in your life.
That's true.
So, some people like the fact that you are leaving your woes behind. How many people do you know that are daily marijuana users that want to be in a blue haze all the time rather than live their life? And
Oh, yeah. They swear it helps them, which is unfortunate. But we're talking about here, when you're talking about addiction, we're talking about, again, something that's critically important to our survival, and that's normal. That's the motivation, pleasure, reward circuit. So it just gets hijacked here.
Right. So what you want to do is try to align that system with earning a living and having a stable marriage and a good family life and balance. And so those things become, if you will, habits. That's the Pavlovian dog as well. Some people may not realize, it's 5:30 in the morning. I see that it's still dark outside, roll over. But some people say it's time to get up and run, And so the idea is that you do have habits, and those habits can be good or bad. And the bad habit is, I see a bar and I got to go in and drink.
You're talking about forced abstinence. When you're talking about a drug of abuse, that's certainly possible. But to me, one of the most diabolical addictions is eating disorders. You have to eat every day, so you have to be exposed to your drug of choice.
Wow, that is a very true statement. And it's very hard to treat that in even the more milder forms. That's why it's so hard to diet. If you could just stop eating, maybe you could lose weight. But, of course, you can't do that. And so whether it's even a binge eating disorder or, basically bulimia, which are, basically disorders, or it's just the overeating of people who in a sedentary society, these are very hard things to manage because you can't stop it. At least you can stop. I mean, you can't. It's interesting. Most addictions are not thought by addiction experts to be treatable if you step down. You gotta generally stop it. I'm not sure I agree with that, but it's really the rare person who can become a social drinker after being an alcoholic.
That's true. No, that's a good point. And it could be that's just overdriving the circuit too. It's really a matter of moderation. Yeah, moderation. That's a curse word to me, Steve. It really is.
Well, there's an old saying I remember from Benjamin Franklin. He says, "Nothing to excess, including moderation."
That's terrific. That is great. Well, we talked about some bad neuroplasticities. We talked about addiction. We talked about treatment-resistant mental illness. What about, you alluded to chronic pain earlier. Let's talk a little bit about that. What's going on?
Well, it's very interesting. If you have pain and it goes away, then that's not so bad. But when you have persistent pain, it causes as a well-known phenomenon in the spinal cord called windup. And you end up getting neuroplastic changes. In fact, one of the earliest documentations of neuroplasticity was in the dorsal root ganglion and the spinal cord after chronic pain.
Interesting.
And what happens, I don't know why would the brain do this, but it decides in the spinal cord to make it easier for pain to come in. And so pain moves from, let's say, your diabetic peripheral neuropathy, which hurts because you're dying back your fibers and they're neuropathic and painful. to the spinal cord and then up, of course, you remember your anatomy, to the thalamus and then to the cortex. At each stop station there along the way, there's a synapse, and that synapse becomes neuroplastically enhanced. So much so that if you don't believe me, you can cut the legs off of a diabetic and they still will have their legs hurt.
That's right. Phantom
pain. Because the area that used to be innervated by the feet that used to be there is topographically represented in the spinal cord, the thalamus, and the cortex, and it's still there. And so the pain has moved neuroplastically from the periphery into the brain.
I see. It metastasizes.
And so how do you undo that? Well, I guess what doesn't do it? Taking opioids every day. We've played that experiment, the chronic opioids. A funny thing about that, not really funny, but how it's opioids probably only work for 10 days. Yeah. And then in chronic pain, it probably works a little bit, but boy, it doesn't work much better than a lot of things with other mechanisms. And that's because it's really not the acute pain pathway that's being activated. It's this neuroplastic, if you will, diabolical one. And so, we don't really know how to undo it, though.
Is this why sometimes anticonvulsants can help with this kind of pain?
We think so. I think that what people are figuring out is that these nerves are firing, even though it's not like you're taking a hammer and whacking your toes with them and it's a new pain is coming in. Mm-hmm. So why does it feel like your toes are burning? It's because the nerves are firing. And so anticonvulsants tend to suppress neuronal firing. Gabapentin, pregabalin are good examples of that.
Sure. All right. You mentioned earlier, this was one that went by quickly. You mentioned earlier about menstrual cycles in rats and neuroplasticity. Does this happen in humans too?
Well, we don't know, but we assume it does because it's very much related by estrogen. In this case, those specific synapses are enhanced by estrogen, and then they're assassinated by progestins. And you go around and around. You can anthropomorphize that and say that these might change, and be involved with PMS or, mood fluctuations during a cycle. Who knows? But it is amazing that it's profound, it's sudden, and it's reversible. And it's just a general property of these neurons. And it looks like most neurons have that property. And if we can awaken them, it's possible we could cure. However, if we awaken the wrong ones, it's possible that's the pathophysiology of making a mental illness. Mm-hmm. So this is probably both the cause and the consequences and the treatment for our whole field. And we're doing very little to figure out how to control it yet.
Exactly. You're talking about another modality here, and that's hormones. Our brain, the neurons are loaded with hormone receptors as well, and yet we don't think about those as therapeutics.
That's right. I mean, there's thyroid hormones. There's, of course, the glucocorticoid hormones. There's estrogen, progesterone. And in fact, if you look at some of the newer drugs, neuroactive steroids, those are actually offputs of estrogen, allopregnenolone, which is made by your own glia cells from cholesterol, and are used as messengers in the brain, even the men and women alike.
Really incredible stuff. So one of the messages I guess we want to leave our audience with is it's a very exciting time, but at the same time, we need to be a little scared here and a little bit afraid of some of the things that we're capable of. It's a great power we have here to influence neuroplasticity.
Well, I'm glad you picked that up because that's exactly my message is that whereas I really want to be excited about the potential of this, I also think we don't want to be reckless about it. And, doing psychotherapy in people who are vulnerable because we've rendered them that way because they just took a dose of a neuroplastogen, just be careful. I'm not saying don't do anything about it, but realize that the brain has both good and bad neuroplasticity, and you certainly don't want to be part of the bad. So do the best you can, read the literature, keep up, use common sense. Don't become arrogant about thinking you're more powerful than you are because we're really quite ignorant, but it doesn't mean we can't progress, and certainly in a research environment.
Yeah. Well, I want to finish up with talking about something that also you alluded to, and that's the fact that we're really on the cusp of what I would call the third wave of psychopharmacology. The first wave, obviously, in the 50s and 60s was the first generation antipsychotics, the TCAs, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And then I certainly started my training around the dawn of the second wave with second-generation antipsychotics, SSRIs, SNRIs, and the like. But we're now on the cusp of going even beyond monoamines to talked about ketamine and glutamatergic agents. You mentioned the muscarinic cholinergic agonists, the new TAR1, the trace amine-associated receptor agonists, and then you talked about the GABAergic drugs. This is very exciting, but along with this comes the fact that we may be inducing this neuroplasticity in a very rapid and, as you said, non-specific way.
Good point. And most of what you just mentioned there are mechanisms to induce not only neuroplasticity, but to do it suddenly. It's possible the old monoamines do it and do it, but probably more slowly. So these maybe, who knows, are they the same things that get turned on and triggered? Are they just faster?
Right.
So we don't know.
Well, that's what I wonder, Steve, exactly. Are we talking about the same pathways, for instance? Are we influencing the pathway much further downstream somehow? We're just sort of cutting to the chase faster, or are we kind of going through a different pathway somehow to get there?
I would prefer to think of it as being the possibility of rapid onset and durable treatments that act on new targets, but also through rapid neuroplasticity. And that's the frontier that we're at.
Right. So the question is, which one is more enduring, perhaps? Which one is more effective? Obviously, this is things we don't know. We suspect that monoamines manipulation works for some people, but for others, maybe you have to go down these other pathways.
Yeah, what do you need? What do I need? There's no markers. Basically, right now, we're choosing some of these new targets by failure to respond to the old targets. That's pretty crude. Hopefully, there'll be some biomarkers coming our way.
Well, I think biomarkers is critical. You're absolutely right. I've said this for years. Other fields of medicine, you're talking about oncology, they can do genetic testing and tell exactly which chemotherapy to work. We're still in a trial and error phase, unfortunately, although maybe we're getting closer. Maybe with technology, with big data analysis, artificial intelligence, we'll be able to come up with something. Certainly, I hope so.
Yeah, I don't think maybe that's the fourth wave of but the third wave is really going to be these agents. We're ready to go now, and we're going to have to go forward without biomarkers.
Yeah, that's right. And we're well into the third wave. I mean, we've got now S-ketamine FDA approved, if you will. Got some of these drugs are in late phase 3 development. I think we're right in that third wave now. It's happening. But you're absolutely right. The question is, and getting back to our original premise here, these are powerful tools that clearly are influencing neuroplasticity, as does many of the other things we talked about. And we can use our powers for good or for evil. And I mean, it makes me think, really, if you go way back, we used to think that leeches were good and draining blood and all kinds of things like this. Who knows? Maybe we're still in that phase and we're just more sophisticated about it, but we still don't know what the heck we're doing. But patients, basically have the chance of getting better, and that's what keeps us doing that. Well, we've all had that experience. We've all had the experience of people getting better. And that does keep us going, doesn't it? You and I did a video years ago, I think, called something like Searching for the Outlier. I remember we talked about that. Well, Steve, as always, I just really enjoy speaking with you, and I hope this has been helpful for our audience. We didn't solve the mysteries, but I think we certainly talked about it and examined it a little bit. Yeah. Everybody, put your seatbelt on. We're blasting off. It's going to be an interesting year. I think so, too. This is really the most excited I've been in my career. It's really exciting. We're going beyond, again, the monoamines and the kind of traditional treatments. Well, I want to thank you all for listening to this PsychopharmaStahlogy podcast from NEI. This is the third in our series of dark things. This is dark neuroplasticity. I want to thank you, Steve, as always. Please keep checking out. We have new podcasts coming in all the time, and we plan more episodes of the PsychopharmaStahlogy show. So thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the NEI Podcast. Please let us know what you'd like to hear more about by leaving a review. Don't miss another episode. Subscribe today.